hearing is fully virtual, we must address a few housekeeping matters. For today's meeting, the chair or staff designated by the chair may mute participants' microphones when they are not under recognition for the purposes of eliminating inadvertent background noise. Members are responsible for muting and unmuting themselves. If I notice when you are recognized that you have not unmuted yourself, I will ask the staff to send you a request to unmute yourself. Please then accept that request or you are no longer muted. I remind all members and witnesses that the 5-minute clock still applies. If there is a technology issue, we will move to the next member until the issue is resolved and you will retain the balance of your time. You will notice a clock on your screen that will show how much time is remaining. At 1 minute remaining, the clock will turn to yellow. At 30 seconds remaining, I will gently tap the gavel to remind members that their time is almost expired. When your time has expired, the clock will turn red and I will begin to recognize the next member. In terms of the speaking order, we will begin with the chair and ranking member, then members present at the time the hearing is called to order will be recognized in order of seniority. And finally, members not present at the time the hearing is called to order. Finally, the rules of the House require me to remind you that we have set up an email address to which members can send anything they wish to submit in writing at any of our hearings or markups. That email address has been provided in advance to your staff. I want to say a thank you to Ranking Member Cole and all the members of the subcommittee joining today's hearing. Before we begin, I want to take a moment to address the tragedy that occurred in Texas yesterday. I'm angry, I'm in disbelief to be here once again. Yesterday, the students and the teachers at Robb Elementary School in Uvalde, Texas, woke up ready to learn. They woke up ready to teach, but 19 children, 1 teacher, and a school employee went to school only to be taken from us forever. It's a senseless attack. It's absolutely heartbreaking, but it isn't anything new. Mass shootings are taking the lives of babies, of parents, of brothers and sisters everywhere. And you know, my community knows this all too well. Tragedy occurred at Sandy Hook Elementary School nearly 10 years ago. It took the lives of 20 beautiful, innocent souls, babies, and 6 teachers, and it shook us to our very core. We are gathered today for this hearing to find ways to support our educators. But how can we begin to speak of support for our teachers if they are not physically safe at school? It is alarming and it's outrageous that so many children in America's schools and their parents and teachers worry that a senseless act of gun violence could take their lives. The American people and our nation's children are waiting for us to take immediate action to save innocent kids and to save their teachers. In today's hearing, we will examine the root causes driving the teacher shortage. While we were not expecting yesterday's tragedy to loom over our conversation today, we must keep it at the top of our mind as we consider the challenges that our educators confront each day nationwide. So I welcome our witnesses today. Desiree Carver-Thomas, researcher and policy analyst at the Learning Policy Institute. Dr. Lindsay Burke, director of the Center for Education Policy, the Heritage Foundation. Ms. Randy Weingarten, president, American Federation of Teachers. Dr. Jane West, education policy consultant. It is a selfless act to choose teaching as a career. The Americans who choose this path go in with the admirable goal of educating future generations and helping students of all ages and backgrounds succeed. I'm sure everyone here today remembers a teacher who inspired us along the way. Teachers can change the course of their students' lives, sharing knowledge and starting students down a path for successful futures. Good teachers are essential to our progress as a nation. You know, as a substitute teacher early in my career, I bore witness to the challenging work that educators do and the demands that they are put under every day, something that's hard to grasp unless you are in the position yourself. I trust our teachers, and I know it is our job to provide them with the resources and the support that they need to thrive. The witnesses with us today know this well. They represent a diverse group focused on the wellness of our students and their educators. But they also know that the teacher shortage plaguing our nation threatens all those teachers provide to our students. If there are not teachers to educate our kids, the very foundation on which our nation's progress is built gets dissolved. Every student deserves a high quality education, but teacher shortages threaten our ability to provide that education. The pandemic exacerbated the existing challenges our nation faced to ensure every student has access to the diverse and well-prepared educators they deserve. In the 2017-18 school year, nearly every state, including my state of Connecticut, experienced teacher shortages in high-need subjects and in special education. And that same year, more than 100,000 teaching positions around the country were vacant or staffed by people unqualified for the job. In New Haven Public Schools in my district today, there are over 150 vacancies for certified teaching positions. Teachers are unfortunately leaving the profession. There has been a significant increase in retirement and a dramatically shrinking pipeline into the profession, with over 300,000 fewer students enrolling in teacher preparation programs over the past decade. Potential teachers struggle with financial concerns, with the high cost of preparation, with the subsequent burden of student debt, and with a lack of competitive compensation. K-12 teachers earn 20% less than other college graduates do, further creating recruitment and retention issues. A Rand Corporation report found that the top reason for teacher departures was that pay did not match the stress or the risks of the job. Alongside these issues is a high turnover rate, a rate double that of other high achieving nations, a lack of administration support, dissatisfaction with testing and accountability pressures, lack of opportunities for advancement, and disappointing working conditions lead teachers to other professions. And this was all before the pandemic imposed new burdens on our schools and their teachers. The total enrollment in undergraduate institutions dropped by 6.6%, including 14.1% for community colleges. This concerns me greatly since 80% of our educators start their teaching career with a bachelor's degree, and community colleges that link with a four-year institution are a unique source of diverse teachers. Tragically, as a result of teacher shortages and the impact of the pandemic, 55% of educators reported in a January National Education Association survey that they will leave the profession sooner than they had planned. These are not just numbers. These highlight the very real crisis impacting students across the nation. The achievement gap that students of color, low-income students, and students with disabilities tragically experience is in large part due to inequitable access to qualified teachers. Every student and every child benefits from having diverse teachers, and in a nation where the majority of students are people of color, a workforce made up of just 20% teachers of color is not enough. And tragically, data reported to the Department of Education for this year projected a shortage of educators trained to meet the needs of students with disabilities in all but 2 states. Congress has a lot of work to do to address teacher shortages, and I intend to lead these efforts. Since becoming chair of the subcommittee, we have increased funding in a bipartisan way for comprehensive educator preparation programs, including the recently passed fiscal year 2022 omnibus. We included $59 million for Teacher Quality Partnership Grant Program to fund educator residences and other high retention pathways, $95 million for the IDEA Personnel Preparation Program to prepare special educators and the higher education faculty and researchers who support their training, $8 million in first-time funding for Hawkins Centers of Excellence. We are supporting educator training at HBCUs and in MSIs. And we provided $2.2 billion in Title II, a critical source of funding for the preparation and professional development of teachers. There is more we must be doing. Our witnesses lay out solutions to many of the problems we face. I share their view that proactive investments in pipeline and preparation programs will help us reduce shortages in the years to come. As we build this subcommittee's fiscal year 2023 funding bill, we must consider the funding and policies necessary to help increase recruitment and retention, improve working conditions, and support teacher advancement. Our first Secretary of Education and the woman who made the department and federal support for our teachers into what it is today, Shirley Hufstetler, said, and I quote, to the teacher, America entrusts her most precious resource, her children, and asks that they be prepared to face the rigors of individual participation in a democratic society. As we all know, we are experiencing emergency level teacher shortages. From our witnesses, I look forward to learning how this committee and the federal government can continue to address this crisis and ensure that every student has access to a well-prepared, well-paid, diverse, stable, and supportive teacher. In our country, teaching has always been one of our most highly revered professions, and we must do everything that we can to keep it that way. After all, we do entrust our teachers with our most precious resources and ultimately the future of our democracy. And now let me turn to our ranking member, Mr. Cole, for his opening remarks.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Obviously, this is a difficult morning for all of us, and I want to associate myself with your opening remarks. I can't imagine what our friends and neighbors are dealing with in Uvalde, Texas this morning, what each one of those families are going through, what everybody in that school is experiencing. Obviously, you're most sympathetic to those who lost loved ones, but the trauma of an event like that for every child that was there, for every teacher that was there, for every parent who hopefully his child made it through, but went through hours of wondering. I can't imagine it. And so I want to express my deepest sympathy and just prayers and thoughts and sadness at this enormous event. Yesterday, I actually had the opportunity, it always touches you, but when you have a hearing like the one we're having this morning, I had the great privilege of having our Teacher of the Year in Oklahoma in my office yesterday. She actually teaches in the Norman School District where I'm broadcasting from. Jessica Eschbach, terrific young person, went into teaching almost by accident, began a career in accounting, or started that way, and thought that really wasn't for her. She was going to be a teacher. Ended up moving to Oklahoma and getting her degrees here, and has been just a star. And I think about somebody like that having to deal with what her colleagues in Uvalde are dealing with, or my own son, who's a public school teacher as well in my home system and more. And my hearts go out to everyone involved. I want to thank you, Madam Chair, for calling the hearing, and I particularly want to thank all of our witnesses for being here today. I always look forward to these discussions. Parents, teachers, and children across the country are still reeling for what I believe was one of the biggest policy missteps of this pandemic, and that is the closure of many of our nation's public schools for nearly 2 years. The school closures hit the most vulnerable children the hardest. Those with disabilities, those without access to technology, or parents who could help them in a virtual environment, children in minority communities, and those who had a difficult time learning through computer screen. But all children have suffered. The lasting impact of the pandemic on our students has been profound. We've seen concerning rates of mental health illness, missed preventive care, self-harm, an ongoing lack of engagement, not to mention the lost academic and study skills. And the impact on teachers has been profound as well. When this hearing topic was first announced, and I asked the staff to prepare some background materials on why teachers leave the profession, we expected to get into a list of some reasons, such as I can't learn, or quote, I can earn more from outside the classroom, and that's certainly true. or there's just simply too much red tape. We probably all agree on that too. Or even things like mask and vaccine mandates and pandemic exhaustion. And I expect those are reasons you'll find in many policy papers on this topic. But then we started to ask actual teachers why they left, or are you considering leaving? And their answers were very sobering and saddening. Almost uniformly, teachers from different parts of the country who left or who were thinking of leaving teaching gave some of the same reasons. Quote, a lack of respect from parents, unquote. Quote, lack of respect from students, unquote. Pressure to keep passing students who haven't mastered the material on to the next grade level. Or quote, students don't come to class and there's no consequence. Administrators don't understand the stresses teachers are under and just keep adding more to our plates. This sense that many teachers feel undervalued, unappreciated, and not understood or respected to the point of choosing to leave their jobs is deeply troubling to me. Teaching should be one of the most valued, most appreciated, and most respected professions in the country, as teachers are laying the foundation not only to train all future professions, but also to foster that common bond of civility, understanding, and patriotism that will sustain us as a nation in the next generation. There's no single program we can create at the federal level to change this. This requires a shift in our culture. I don't have the answers today, but I do think we need to confront and talk about this very real problem. And I want to thank our witnesses again for all they've done professionally over the course of their career, for focusing on this problem, and for coming before us today and sharing their time and their expertise. Madam Chair, I want to thank you again for holding the hearing, and I yield back the balance of my time.
I thank the gentleman from Oklahoma, and with that, I am delighted to introduce our witnesses for their testimony. Our first witness today is Desiree Carver-Thomas. And Ms. Thomas, your full written testimony will be included in the record. You are now recognized for 5 minutes for your opening statement.
Thank you, Chair DeLauro, Ranking Member Cole, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the invitation to participate in this hearing. I'm Desiree Carver-Thomas, and I'm a researcher and policy analyst at Learning Policy Institute. We've been deeply engaged in synthesizing the research on teacher diversity. The large body of evidence demonstrates that teachers of color provide cultural knowledge and role modeling that enrich the whole school community, with particularly strong benefits for Black students taught by Black teachers. One analysis found that Black elementary students with Black teachers had higher reading and math test scores than students without Black teachers. Another showed that Black students assigned to a class with a Black teacher at least once in grades 3 to 5 were less likely to drop out of high school and more likely to aspire to go to college. In other words, the benefits of having a Black teacher for even 1 year in elementary school can persist over several years. Other studies show declines in suspensions, expulsions, and chronic absenteeism, and high rates of feeling cared for and academically challenged. And many of these studies suggest that other students, including white students, experience similar benefits. The share of teachers of color has increased from 12% of teachers 30 years ago to 21% in 2017. Still, that share is low compared to the 40% of people of color in the nation. Further, high turnover rates offset successful recruitment of teachers of color in recent years. In addition, student loan debt impacts teacher diversity. Research shows college students of color are more likely than white students to say that they changed their career paths because of their loans. Student loan debt is also much greater for Black students than for white students, with a widening gap over time. Given loan debt issues, college students of color are more likely to or less likely to enroll in teacher preparation programs than are white college students, and more likely to enter through alternative certification pathways. These teachers tend to complete less pre-service coursework in student teaching, if any, and teachers who do not get comprehensive pre-service preparation leave at 2 to 3 times the rates of those who do. Nearly half of newly hired Black teachers enter through alternative certification pathways, compared to just 22% of other first-year teachers. Challenging teaching conditions can lead to higher turnover. Teachers of color are most likely to teach in schools serving a majority of students of color, schools that often contend with a lack of resources and support. In addition, some teachers report facing discrimination and stereotyping. Effective school leaders can influence these teaching conditions. Poor school leadership, however, more than doubles the likelihood that teachers will turn over. Congress can support diversity and high quality preparation through the appropriations process and other legislative vehicles, including the $9 billion roadmap for the workforce and the American Families Plan. And while federal recovery funds are and can be used to support a diverse and well-prepared workforce, sustained federal investments are needed. All of the existing programs I'll discuss were created or updated on a bipartisan basis. First, underwriting the cost of teacher preparation can encourage more students of color to pursue teaching and to do so through a high-quality program that promotes greater teacher retention. Service scholarships and loan forgiveness programs cover or reimburse a portion of preparation costs in exchange for a commitment to teach in a high-need school or subject area. These programs are most effective at recruiting teachers when they underwrite a significant portion of costs. Teacher residencies are district university partnerships. Residents apprentice with effective mentor teachers for a year in a high-need school and subject while completing related coursework. Residents receive financial support and commit to teach at least 3 years in their district with ongoing mentoring. Nationally, about half of residents are people of color, and residents tend to have higher retention rates than other teachers. Congress could update federal service scholarship and loan forgiveness programs, which have not been substantially updated by Congress since George W. Bush was president. Since 2008, student loan debt has grown by over $1 trillion. Congress can increase the Teach Grant Award to $8,000 and can change the teacher loan forgiveness and public service loan forgiveness programs to have the federal government make teachers monthly loan payments until they meet the service requirement and retire the debts. Congress could also expand investments in high retention pathways into teaching, the Teacher Quality Partnership Program, IDEA, Hawkins Center of Excellence Program, and Supporting Effective Instruction Program fund high retention pathways like residencies. Additionally, we do not have a program dedicated to making high need and advanced credentials more affordable. Next, mentoring and induction, including collaboration, coaching, can support beginning teachers of color. New teachers who do not receive induction supports are twice as likely to leave teaching as those who do, yet there's no federal funding dedicated to this purpose. Finally, robust federal funding for high retention pathways into leadership can develop strong school leaders who improve school conditions, which can help teachers of color teach for the long haul. In closing, research demonstrates there's an urgent need for a well-prepared and diverse educator workforce, and there's strong bipartisan role for Congress to play in this endeavor. Thank you for your focus on the issue, and I look forward to answering any questions members have.
Thank you very, very much. And let me next introduce our witness, Dr. Lindsay Burke. Dr. Burke, your full testimony will be entered into the record, and you're now recognized for 5 minutes. And thank you for being here.
Thank you. My name is Lindsay Burke. I'm the Mark A. Cola-Catronis Fellow in Education and the Director of the Center for Education Policy at the Heritage Foundation. Thank you, Chair DeLauro and Ranking Member Cole, for the opportunity to testify today. We are brokenhearted about the events that transpired in Uvalde, Texas yesterday at Robb Elementary School, and our prayers are with the families. We're here today to talk about teachers, and 2 educators died protecting our students yesterday. And we know that's who our teachers are. In America, that's why we treasure and value our teachers, because that's who they are. Although there has been teacher turnover as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, teacher vacancies have to be considered in the larger context of ongoing increases in school staff hires. Today, teachers comprise only half of education jobs. This is part of a longer-term trend that Dr. Benjamin Scafidi has been tracking for many years. Since 1950, public schools have added personnel at a rate nearly 4 times that of the rate of growth in student enrollment, while the increase in new teacher hires was nearly 2.5 times the increase in students. The number of non-teachers, that is administrative and other staff, increased more than 7 times that of student enrollment. So if school districts want to attract more high quality teachers to local classrooms, what policies should state legislatures, and school boards pursue? First, they should remove barriers to entry into the classroom. The teaching profession is constrained by policies that mandate aspiring teachers obtain paper credentials, often at substantial cost. However, research has demonstrated there is little, if any, connection between teacher certification and a teacher's impact on student academic achievement. The absence of a relationship between teacher certification and teacher effectiveness is most noticeable in the negligible difference in outcomes between traditionally certified, alternatively certified, and uncertified teachers. As researchers Robert Gordon, Thomas Kane, and Douglas Steger found, quote, to put it simply, teachers vary considerably in the extent to which they promote student learning, but whether a teacher is certified or not is largely irrelevant to predicting his or her effectiveness. So how can we ensure excellent teachers find their way to the classroom and are encouraged to stay? By making it easier to enter the profession, but rigorously evaluating teachers once they're there. Second, states and districts should tackle pension reform. States should move from defined benefit pension plans in which 85% of public school teachers are enrolled compared to just 15% of private sector workers to defined contribution retirement plans like 401ks popular in the private sector. Switching from defined benefit to defined contribution plans could provide retirement account portability across state lines for teachers, allow them to roll over account balances if they change jobs, and accumulate equal benefits even if they switch employers. Third, districts should eliminate last in, first out policies and reward excellence in the classroom. Too many schools continue to use seniority-based layoffs when staffing decisions have to be made. These last in, first out policies should be abandoned in favor of staffing decisions based on teacher effectiveness and competence, not years in the school building. Finally, states and school districts should end the non-teaching staff hiring spree. Total inflation-adjusted per pupil spending has increased 152% from 1970 to 2018. Teacher salaries increased just 7.3% over the same time period. If districts want to attract and retain high-quality teachers, they should refrain from continuing to increase the number of non-teaching staff in public schools and instead revamp teacher compensation systems to better reward those teachers who have a positive impact on student performance. Public school districts have the tools and considerable financial resources at their disposal to attract and retain quality teachers. But that outcome requires making different decisions than what school districts have made historically. They can begin by eliminating certification barriers, tackling pension reform, ending last in, first out policies, and curtailing the non-teaching staffing surge. I look forward to answering any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much. And let me just now recognize our next witness, Randy Weingarten, for your full testimony, which will be included in the record. You're recognized now for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair DeLauro, and thank you, Ranking Member Cole. I'm Randy Weingarten. I'm the president of the American Federation of Teachers, and I am still a teacher on leave from my social studies position as a high school teacher at Clara Barton High School in Brooklyn, New York. We are all in mourning today. It's only in America that parents are not assured that their kids will be safe from gun violence at school. And while educators had a really important job yesterday, they are more important today than ever. And I'm here to talk about the staffing shortages facing America's public schools. I have been working on this issue for about 40 years or so, and about how to solve the crisis and how Congress can help. And, staffing shortages are not just a school problem, they're a national crisis. Every year, nearly 300,000 teachers leave the profession, 2/3 of them before retirement. Frankly, we have done many surveys, and the pensions are one of the things that keep teachers in teaching. Teacher turnover is almost double that of any other occupation of their peers, and schools that serve majorities of students of color and with those students who live in poverty experience a higher teacher turnover rates, and COVID has made this worse. So I'm going to tick off 4 different things that I suggest that we do, but it all goes to the question, what would make you recommend a career in teaching to your own child or to your grandchild, particularly in public schools, and what can you do to help? Number 1, we can actually do much more in terms of recruitment and preparation of a high quality, diverse teaching force. Over 80% of teachers are now white and female, while students of color make up about 50% of the student population. Our ranks should reflect this diversity. And so the Grow Your Own programs, which educate and credential support staff to become certified teachers, are really good programs. And historically Black colleges and other minority serving institutions who prepare half of all teachers of color in this country, we can actually fund them more. Number two, retaining teachers is as important as recruiting teachers. And so I would urge us to give educators the time, the tools, the trust to teach well. That means reducing class size to have more individual attention, and that means increasing planning time, which is what the countries that that compete with us do. And it also means enabling workload educators to create teams in terms of sharing workloads. The investment in community schools and mental health supports will keep more teachers. Full service community schools, wrapping around services of schools, will actually help kids and help teachers teach and identify problems that we see before we see these kind of awful situations that we saw last night. Let's actually try to deal with paperwork. Last week, New Mexico Governor Stephanie Lujan Grisham signed an executive order to reduce paperwork and administrative burdens on educators, enabling them to focus on students. This, as well as salaries, is the number one issues that teachers talk about as well. And as a result, if we actually try to start thinking about how to change the accountability systems, we can reduce paperwork. We need to make an accountability system that is aligned to what kids need to do, be able to do and know, as opposed to the paper pencil system we have now. Obviously, compensation is important. Teachers make 20% less than what they can earn in other similarly skilled professions. And we are a profession. Let's find ways to deal with that. And there's a whole bunch of federal programs that can help us do that. We can also do something in terms of public service loan forgiveness. As some of the other speakers have said, the public service loan forgiveness program can help us reduce teacher debt, and that can be changed in that way. The TEACH program can also do the same thing. And the last thing I would say is let's actually increase collective bargaining, pass the Public Service Freedom to Negotiate Act, give teachers the right to bargain, make them part of the solution. That's what we have done in places that are moving forward. That's what we should do everywhere. When teachers have voice and agency in their work, kids thrive. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And let me now recognize Dr. Jane West. And again, your full testimony will be read into the record, and you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair DeLauro. Thank you, Ranking Member Cole. Thank you, members of the committee. I'm pleased to be here to talk about the critical shortage of special educators facing our nation. In 1975, the Congress enacted the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, IDEA, enabling students with disabilities to gain full access to education after decades of exclusion. For 47 years, the law has required a free, appropriate public education for every student with a disability, no matter how significant that disability. As a special educator before the enactment of the law and afterwards, I can tell you what a difference it makes. The challenge we face today is one of fully implementing the law. While IDEA requires that services are delivered by qualified personnel, that is increasingly not happening. The critical obstacle is the crisis of a special educator shortage. Among special education teachers, paraprofessionals, school psychologists, early intervention providers, speech therapists, specialized instructional personnel, and more. Our shrinking capacity in higher education to prepare special educators threatens the pipeline for the future. The pervasive challenges that other witnesses have outlined of high student debt, low teacher salaries, declining respect for the profession, and the stress of the COVID pandemic affect special educators as well. For special education, the combination of a dearth of fully prepared new teachers and the high attrition rate has generated an urgent challenge for today and the future. The scope of the shortage is alarming. 48 states and the District of Columbia report a shortage of special education teachers, outpacing shortages in other fields, including math and science. 98% of school districts report special education shortages. The proportion of uncertified teachers grew by 50% from 2014 to 2016, and that number continues to grow. In some states, like California, over half of new special educators are not fully prepared. The enrollment in special education preparation programs has also declined by 16% in recent years for initial licensure programs, which does not bode well for the future. We confront this crisis at the same time the number of students requiring special education services has increased 17% since 2000-2001. States and districts have had to scramble to fill special education positions in ways that are unsustainable over time and will exacerbate the problem rather than solve it. Lowered standards for certification, an increase in the use of long-term substitutes, and the expansion of short-term programs which place people as teachers without the needed skills and knowledge will keep the schools open, but they will not generate the results that we want for students with disabilities, nor expand the qualified workforce. The shortage leads to larger caseloads for special educators with less time for students with complex needs. And stretched too thin, special educators burn out and students are underserved. We know preparation matters. Generally, teachers who are underprepared, such as those entering the profession through emergency and alternative pathways that do not offer robust student teaching and a full curriculum, are 2 to 3 times more likely to leave than those who are fully prepared. Research shows that comprehensively prepared and credentialed educators are more likely to stay in the field and are best equipped to deliver results for students. Without the qualified personnel, student outcomes suffer. A parent recently shared with me her journey with her son with dyslexia, which was presenting great obstacles to him in learning to read, resulting in tremendous frustration. When he gained access to fully prepared teachers with expertise in reading instruction, he blossomed. Today, at age 27, he is applying to a doctoral program. This is the difference that highly qualified and trained teachers make. Multiple innovative solutions are in place across the country, including teacher residency programs, recruitment strategies for high school students, grow your own programs, use of teacher candidates as substitutes for part of their teacher training programs. We know what strategies work. A greater investment will enable them to meet the moment. 2 federal programs have solid and proven track records in carrying out these solutions, and a newly funded one will address the dire lack of diversity in our workforce. I urge the subcommittee to provide greater investments in the personnel preparation program under IDEA, the Teacher Quality Partnership grants, and the Hawkins Centers for Excellence programs. In summary, students with disabilities need access to a well-prepared, diverse, experienced, and stable educator workforce. A greater investment in these programs is urgently needed. Thank you.
Thank you. And I want to say thank you to all of the witnesses for outstanding testimony this morning. And thank you. It's a struggle, I think, today for all of us. And for those of you who have been engaged and involved with the teaching profession and educating students and understanding what allows them to learn, and I know your hearts are full. And thank you for carrying on. It's important. It's an important discussion. And by the way, this is the first teacher shortage hearing that we have had since the pandemic, so it's particularly important. In addressing the teacher shortages, some states are lowering the qualifications of becoming a teacher. Example, Connecticut, State Board of Education voted to authorize emergency certification that allows individuals to fill teaching positions for subjects in which they are not certified, a practice that the state ended nearly 30 years ago. I have 2 questions here. Does Ms. Carver-Thomas, what does the research say about the importance of having access to fully certified teachers? And Dr. West, what is the real life impact on students with disabilities and their families when students are faced with a person serving as a special educator who does not have the training or skills to teach them. Dr. West? No, Ms. Carver Thompson first.
Thank you for the question, Chair DeLauro. The research is clear that teacher certification matters for our students and for our schools in several ways, and I can talk about a few of those, including student achievement, teacher shortages, which we're here to discuss, and financial costs. So when it comes to student achievement, there's research showing that there's an association between full certification and student outcomes. A study led by Learning Policy Institute researchers, our positive outlier study, looked at California districts and the relationship between teacher characteristics and student outcomes, and found that districts with more fully credentialed teachers had better student outcomes, particularly for Black and Latino students. And this was after controlling for a range of other school and teacher characteristics. When it comes to shortages, we know that when there aren't enough fully credentialed teachers to go around, districts and schools will turn to emergency credentialed teachers, teachers who are not fully prepared to teach their subject matter. And these are teachers who are more likely to leave that school or the profession entirely, creating a level of churn that creates instability in schools, disrupts the transfer of institutional knowledge, disrupts professional learning, disrupts student learning. And we know that that sort of churn disproportionately impacts students of color and students from low-income families who really bear the brunt of that kind of teacher demographics, where more under-credentialed teachers are serving those students. And then when it comes to financial costs, it costs money for districts to recruit, hire, support, train teachers who they bring into the classroom. And if those teachers are coming in and out, having to constantly be replaced, those costs walk out the door with those teachers, those investments do. And those are investments that could be put to better use for our students.
Thank you. Dr. West, the impact on students with disabilities.
Thank you. You know, Chair DeLauro, I'd like to start by reminding us who we're talking about. We're talking about students with autism. We're talking about students with intellectual disabilities. We're talking about students who are deaf, students who are blind. We're talking about students with learning disabilities. These are the students we're talking about. Imagine going into a classroom without the proper preparation and seeking to teach a nonverbal student with autism. These are significant skills that need to be acquired and developed during comprehensive and intense preparation. There simply is no way, no substitute for developing that skill set. I was talking to a parent yesterday who has a 6-year-old with Down syndrome, and she was sharing with me that he has developed sort of wandering away behaviors, which is not uncommon in students with Down syndrome. And the strategies that one might commonly use, such as being very firm and, you know, come back here, don't do that, particularly if it's a situation at home or something, reinforces behavior. And research shows us there are other ways to manage this behavior that will not reinforce it. And if you aren't aware of that, the behavior escalates. And that's just one example. I also want to point out that many students with disabilities, most students with disabilities, are in general ed classrooms most of the time. So that partnership between special educators with that unique skill set and the content knowledge of general educators is critical to the delivery of strong academic services and social emotional support to all students. So special educators also have a great investment in fully prepared, fully credentialed educators in other fields. Thank you.
Thank you. Just a note, I mentioned in my opening comments that early on in my career, I finished graduate school and looking for a job. And one of the things I decided to do while I was looking was to make myself available to be a substitute teacher. Okay, I graduated with a BA, an MA, and not in teaching, profession. And I would tell you that I was called as a substitute teacher just about every single day. And I was not, so, you're in essence, you're trying, but you're really trying to manage the classroom and keep it keep it together and not have that. But we do have substitute teachers who are in all time, and without the training, there is a loss, especially if a teacher is ill and out for length of time. My one comment on the special ed, I went to a special ed class one day, and the teacher was well qualified, left the lesson, and it was around the holidays, and that was to make decorations, Christmas decorations from macaroni. Well, I'm not trained as a special ed teacher. I don't know the balance between discipline and compassion in that sense. My instincts were all on the compassion side. Whatever these children were going to do, they were going to do. I will just tell you that by noontime, we were almost knee deep in macaroni in this classroom. It's humorous, but nevertheless, I don't have the skills to be there. And you need to have trained people. Your view of using trained people to be substitute teachers. So with that, I've gone over my time, and I yield to our ranking member, Mr. Cole.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair. You're pretty good at keeping order among the unruly students on this committee. So I think your earlier training did well. Let me start with you, Dr. Burke. And this is a question, but any of you I would invite to answer. We know we obviously have shortage overall, but we have acute shortages in specific areas. Special ed obviously has been mentioned. Math and science usually also reach that. And yet in most school systems, pay is pretty uniform. It's based on seniority and credentials overall. Is there merit in doing what they do at the college level, which is, as a guy that was a history professor in college, I can tell you I didn't make what anybody in the engineering department made or anybody at the business school made. And I don't begrudge them that. I don't mean that critically of anybody. It was just my skill was more common, more available than the others. So would it be worthwhile having pay differentials in specific shortage areas to try and attract more people and retain them for longer?
Thank you, Representative Cole. That would definitely be worthwhile, thinking about how districts can differentiate pay for high demand areas, not only for high demand areas, but to differentiate pay to reward teachers who are doing excellent work in the classroom, who are getting their cohorts of students to learn a year or a year and a half worth of learning in a year's time, to really reward those exceptional teachers. But schools have largely made a decision to take existing resources, which, as I mentioned earlier, have increased significantly over the past half century, and to use those taxpayer resources to fund and hire non-teaching staff instead of putting that into something like differentiated teacher salaries. So again, if we just look at the recent data, if you go back just to the year 2000, from 2000 to 2019, while the number of students and teachers in public schools just increased about 8%, the number of principals and assistant principals increased 37%. And the number of school district administrative staff increased 88%. So again, this is about decisions, about choices that districts are making. And we can look at those overall aggregate numbers. If we go back even further, back to 1950, I mentioned spending increasing significantly since that time period. A big part of that is this increase in non-teaching staff. The number of students increased about 100% from 1950 forward, but the number of teachers increased 243%. The number of administrators and non-teaching staff increased 709% over that time period. So you're absolutely right. Differentiated pay is critically important. Rewarding excellent teachers with differentiated pay is important, but that will require making different decisions than schools have made in the past.
Let me ask you a quick follow-up. And again, I'd invite anybody else if they've got thoughts on this to participate. We're the federal government. We can't and should not, in my opinion, be mandating these kinds of things from here. We can incentivize behaviors, though, that we like, either through programs, and we try to do that on some occasions. As you think broadly across the country, is there anybody doing what we're talking about? I mean, is there any particular system you would say they approach this a little bit differently than most of the states, and this is working better?
Well, I think what we can point to is something that we saw in the wake of COVID, which is how diverse the delivery of instruction is becoming and the way in which that has enabled individuals to enter teaching and to be rewarded. So if we think about something like learning pods and micro schools, these really innovative approaches that are on the ground, these options enable teachers to be paid directly from families. And really, you can imagine a situation where the sky is the limit in terms of earning potential for these instructors. And hopefully that is where we get to a point where these excellent in-demand teachers are rewarded handsomely.
Dr. Carver-Thomas, I don't have a lot of time left, but let me turn to you, because I couldn't agree more with your basic point about the importance of diversity in the teaching and kids seeing people that look like themselves pursuing the profession. We know our record's not what any of us would want it to be in that regard. Again, is there a particular place or state or systems, in your opinion, that are handling this better that we should look at? These are folks that are aggressively recruiting for diversity or and achieving this goal.
Yeah, thank you for the question, Representative Cole. Absolutely, there are programs like those funded by some of the programs I talked about today, the TQP, like teacher residencies, that have become very popular across the country. And there are states like California that are investing, making considerable investments in teacher residency programs. And we know that these programs tend to have much higher levels of diversity than the teacher workforce at large. And that's largely because it's comprehensive preparation, but residents also receive a stipend during their residency year. They receive ongoing mentoring support. They receive aligned clinical experience that is really deep. It lasts typically a full school year while they're also completing coursework. And they tend to have much higher retention rates than do teachers prepared through other pathways. So it's a very promising model that we see being invested in. And, in California, we're starting to see an uptick in teacher preparation enrollments, which really defies the national trend because of those considerable investments, but there's still quite a bit of need. And so these kinds of investments are still much needed.
Thank you very much. Madam Chair, just for purposes of notifying you, for whatever reason, I don't see time on my schedule. So I'm guessing I'm about used up my time. If I've gone over, I apologize, but might help if there's some way we could get that displayed on the screen. With that, I yield back. I think you're muted, Madam Chair.
I thought I did that. In any case, Ms. Weingarten had her hand raised to answer your question. So,
oh, I'm sorry. I apologize.
Yep. I would
additional time here. Go ahead, Ms. Weingarten.
So, Congressman Cole, I think that there are ways in which we can do, and there have been various different collective bargaining agreements that have differentiated pay for shortage areas for special needs, like Dr. West was talking about. We've done that a lot. The programs that paid for performance did not work. In fact, they actually hurt. You're seeing a slow walk away from all the race to the top, pay for performance, because what was happening is that people actually left the high need schools where you actually need to have kids, you need to have the best and most well-prepared teachers. So the pay for shortage areas is a really good idea. And we have done that in a bunch of different contracts. But the bottom line is you actually have to have decent pay as the basis of it. People have to rely year after year on being able to feed their families and being able to rely on that kind of income. And that's important as well. And then you can do various different differentials. And the last thing I would say is I agree with Dr. Burke that there have been too many non-classroom positions that have been created, but a lot of that is because of paperwork and the federal accountability systems in terms of, and that's part of the reason why we are seeking to actually change the accountability systems to really focus on what kids need to know and be able to do and make sure that the data is there. But what's happened is that there is a search for data, and there's more and more time that is focused on data collection as opposed to on teaching. And that's why it's one of the number one issues that current teachers have in terms of saying, let me teach, give me the time, tools, and trust so that I can actually meet the needs of my kids.
Yeah, I'm shocked the federal government would generate paperwork. Thank you, Madam Chair. You're back.
Thank you. Mr. Pocan.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and thanks for having this hearing. I know I brought it up, about 3 weeks ago, maybe, if even that, and this is very quick coming together of the hearing. So thank you for having this, and thank you to all the witnesses. All of you provided very concrete examples of suggestions what we should do. Ms. Weingarten, a number of years rung the most true, at least in my state, in Wisconsin. In Wisconsin, we had in 2010, when Scott Walker was governor, he did an attack on public employee unions, and in doing that, an attack on public employees. And the outcome of that, within a year or two, the UW-Madison School of Education, one of the best in the country for a public university, had a drop to about 40% of the applications going to the school that they had prior to that. There really was a respect issue for the profession that we saw directly out of what happened. Right now in Wisconsin, the starting teacher salary that I could look up, so this might be a couple years old, was $26,535, which is in the lowest 25th percentile. Right now, I have fast food restaurants advertising $17 to $20 an hour. If you're equating teaching with a fast food job, certainly you're not going to have a lot of people perhaps looking at that as a career path. My own sister-in-law taught for over a decade and quit teaching because of the disrespect that's now happened. And she taught in a couple different states through the laws in Wisconsin. So the disrespect for the profession, I think that we saw the pay issues, and then throw it on top all the challenges with COVID and everything else. It's had a real impact in a place like Wisconsin. In fact, Madison School District used to be an unattainable school district for many first-time teachers. Now they're getting 2 or 3 applications for some positions. That's it. There's a significant change, at least in my state, that I can look at. A lot of it resonates to what you said specifically. What can we do around that issue, giving teachers respect again for the profession within the districts, and the respect of a salary that's not the bottom 25th percentile?
So there's 2 things that, as a school teacher, I mean, number one of the first things, that's why I said to all of you, because there's a lot of common sense that's involved here, and a lot of the research about what actually happens in schools, you cannot control for every single factor that happens in schools. So that's why I say, and I ask you, what would make you as a person recommend a career in teaching to your child or grandchild? And it comes down to actually 2 things. Teachers, thank God, they go into teaching because they want to make a difference in other people's lives. And that's something that you can't recruit. That is who teachers are. But what we can do is we can make their lives such that they don't walk into school with a pit in their stomach or a pit in their throat, that they can actually have freedom and latitude to meet the needs of their kids when they see those needs. You can call that trust, you can call that tools, you can call that time, you can call that respect, but it comes down to, we're not automatons. We have to actually have some latitude to teach, and some kind of benefit of a sense that what we're doing is right, and have that. That's number one. Number 2 is the preparation, the support. And Dr. Carver Thomas said this about how these residency programs, the grow your own programs, really help you walk in with that preparation. It's both the book preparation as well as the preparation so that you know the circumstances you're walking into. And the second big thing is pay, so that people can actually raise a family on the pay that they have.
So in this appropriations process, I think there are some very specific suggestions from Dr. Carver-Thomas that we could do immediately, and I appreciate that. In this budget, what could we do most immediately, Ms. Weingarten, that you think would be helpful?
So there's three things you can do. You can increase the investments in terms of the Augusta Hawkins investment program, so that we can actually really focus on grow your own residency programs, particularly with HBCUs. Number two, you can really increase the amount of money that goes to community schools and to wraparound services so that teachers can actually meet the needs of kids. And number three, just like the ARP money and the IDEA money and things like that, these things can go into how we can increase the compensation of teachers.
Great. Thank you very much. And I yield back, Madam Chair.
Okay, I think that's where we are. Yes, Dr. Harris.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Thanks to everyone who's appearing today. You know, I don't know what's going on in Wisconsin, but in Baltimore County, the starting salary is $49,900. So it's probably a local issue, and certainly the federal government shouldn't be involved in that. That should all be negotiated at the local level. Anyway, I just have a question for Ms. Weingarten. Do you think that teachers should be able to strike?
Dr. Harris, I think that I think that we should have these kind of collective bargaining programs.
Ma'am, I have 5 minutes. I have a lot of questions to ask. Do you think teachers should be able to strike?
I think that that teachers should do everything that they can,
and
as we do.
Do you think teachers should be able to strike? It's a simple question, because other public servants, for instance, our law enforcement, they can collective bargain, but they can't strike because we think their role is very important in the community. And as professionals, we think they shouldn't strike. Do you believe that teachers should be able to strike? It's a very simple question. It's a yes or no. You either believe it or you don't.
So, sir, I believe that every single worker in America.
Okay, let me go on to Ms. Burke, because you're not answering my question. You're not answering my question. I understand why. Ma'am, you're not answering the question. I understand why, because it's embarrassing that teachers go out on strike. These are professionals who are supposed to be some of the most important parts of our children's life, their education, and they go on strike sometimes for weeks without these children getting an education. Now, Ms. Burke, Dr. Burke, let me ask you, what's the history of unionization? And ma'am, I'm moving on. I only have a limited amount of time. No filibustering allowed for you. Dr. Burke, what's the history of unionization? Because it appears that we have gotten worse teaching over the last 50 years, and at the same time, unionization of teaching increased. So is there a connection? Is it the inability to, I won't say weed out, but to discourage teachers who really aren't good, because we, for instance, merit pay is discouraged, where if you teach better, you get paid more instead of just a negotiated salary scale. Could you just run through the history of unionization?
Sure. So unionization, it's been with the teaching profession for a long time, born out in part in the early 20th century as an effort at teacher professionalization. However, to your point, that has really morphed into something entirely different. We see capture of institutions like colleges of education, which, if we want to talk about ways to reward effective teachers and lower their cost of entering the teaching profession, union-supported policies like rewarding teachers for getting a master's degree forces teachers to go into colleges of education and take on more debt than they otherwise would have, while we know at the same time that has no impact on their ability to be an effective teacher or increase student outcomes. If you look overall at salary workers, American wage and salary workers, union membership rates are about 10.3% overall. However, among public school teachers, that rate soars to 70%. It is the highest unionization rate of any employment sector. And so that means millions of members are paying tax-exempt dues revenue to the National Education Association, the American Federation of Teachers annually. And that matters for this conversation because generally speaking, unions end up opposing many of the reforms that actually hold promise for attracting qualified teachers. The reforms that I mentioned earlier, removing certification barriers to entry, addressing unfunded pension liabilities, providing merit pay for exceptional teachers, et cetera. So, and I would add, and I think many would agree that many of these union policies really exacerbated teacher frustration during the pandemic by forcing schools for nearly 2 years to remain closed and forcing educators to engage in emergency remote instruction. And so many of these policies that have really plagued public education for over a century now are rooted in policies that are supported by special interest groups.
Sure. And just on the pension reform, is this an impediment, the lack of pension reform, an impediment to mobility of teachers between districts?
Not necessarily between districts, but it is between states, impediment to their mobility to move state to state, or to consider if they want to exit the profession and find other employment to do that. And that could weigh on your mind ahead of time if you're considering entering the teaching profession, not having that flexibility.
Thank you very much. I yield back.
I'm sorry, Ms. Clark.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, and thank you to all the witnesses for being here today. I just want to echo the comments of some of my colleagues about just how horrifying it is to watch what happened and to underscore that we are not powerless to act. And we haven't been powerless, but we have failed our students, we have failed our teachers by not acting to reduce gun violence in this country. School massacres are not freedom. Shooting children and their teachers in their classrooms is not some extension of a constitutional right. We have to do better, and we will. I want to talk to you about another issue that is facing our country and will not allow us to recover and address this teacher shortage issue fully if we don't tackle the lack of childcare. And when we look at early educators, the median hourly wage in this country is $12.24, not enough to raise a family on. And 1/3 of Head Start positions are unfilled, citing compensation as the #1 reason why they are not taking those jobs. So my question for Ms. Weingarten, and it is good to see you, is can you speak to why a reliable childcare system and the availability of childcare benefits is an important tool for teacher recruitment and retention, and how, as we are working to raise compensation and benefits for teachers, we can also focus on early educators and why that is so important.
So thank you, Representative Clark. I just also want to say, I grew up in a system with the Taylor Law where we did not have the right to strike. The right to strike should only be a last resort. It should never be a first resort. It should only be a last resort. And that's what most teachers do. And I just wanted to make it clear that, what I would have said to that answer. In terms of childcare, one of the things that all of you were working on in the child tax credit, child care, is how do we actually in America reduce the costs for families so that people can actually do the kind of work, deal with the kind of things that they want to do. Unfortunately in America, if you're wealthy enough, childcare is not an issue. If you're not, childcare is a huge issue. And so that's an issue with, with when you have jobs that are anything, outside of being an investment banker or a, equity manager or things like that. So incoming jobs for a teacher, whether it's 60, the 50 to 60,000 that you see in Baltimore, or it's the, substandard wages in early childhood. If you don't have childcare, how is someone going to be able to do that? And so it is how you drive down these costs. In Europe, in Western Europe, there's a package of things that happen for workers so that they don't have to think about paying for that way. They don't have to think about healthcare. They don't have to think about childcare. They don't have to think about retirement security. They just live on those kind of wages. So cutting costs, whether it be student debt costs or whether it be childcare costs, are hugely important.
Thank you for that. And to Ms. Carver-Thomas, I also want to ask, as we are looking at trying to increase our amount of teachers and early educators so that we can help solve this childcare crisis and have the robust public schools that we want, what are you seeing as some of the key barriers that are keeping interested students from entering the teaching profession?
Thank you. I would say that one of the key barriers is affordability of comprehensive preparation. We know that student debt has increased in the past several years, and yet our programs that are designed to help college students afford those costs, like the Teach Grant, have not been substantially updated by Congress since 2008. And so those barriers are even higher for potential teachers of color who research shows are more sensitive to debt and potential wages.
Thank you so much. I see my time has expired. I yield back.
Mr. Molinar.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Dr. Burke and all the members of the panel, thank you for joining us. And Dr. Burke, I had a question for you based on your research. Where are you seeing more interest in aspiring teachers? Is it a geographic issue? Are there certain fields of study that you're finding there's more interest or less interest in being teachers?
Well, I think it might actually be the type of school that teachers can teach in. We're seeing a real renaissance in classical education in particular. We're seeing a growth in the classical charter school movement. And we're seeing as a result of that, that the classical charter sector is actually working to create their own teacher education pipeline for entering those schools. And I think that's partly in response to the fact that we are seeing so much interest in that particular sector.
And how are they creating that pipeline? One of the things that strikes me is often you'll have students, and I'm sympathetic. We've heard a lot about the debt that students have as they finish their preparation for teaching and the length of time. What kinds of innovations are you seeing in that area that is making it easier for people to transition into teaching?
So within the classical sector, some of these schools are partnering with existing colleges of education at universities where they are philosophically aligned in terms of the pedagogy, the curriculum, et cetera. But then some of these K-12 schools, classical schools, are actually working really in-house to educate and prepare teachers to enter into their classroom. At the undergraduate level, you know, if you have the foresight to end up majoring in education, you can enter the teaching profession relatively easily. However, if you decide later on after getting your bachelor's degree that you want to enter the classroom and become a teacher, for most people then that means going back to school, going to get a master's degree, spending $40,000, whatever it might be, to earn that master's, and 2 years of time commitment. And that is untenable for a lot of people. So again, it really does come back to reducing those barriers to entry across every type of K-12 education sector, whether it is the classical charter sector, public, private charter, et cetera, and making sure that those mid-career professionals in particular who would be excellent educators have the ability to do so without spending a lot of time and money to obtain paper credentials.
And is there, I'm sensitive to the role of the federal government versus the state government and local, school boards and everything. What role would the federal government have into making those kinds of innovations, that kind of flexibility, more widely available?
Well, one really good option would be allowing flexibility with all existing federal education dollars. It's always important, of course, to remember that the federal government is a small stakeholder in overall K-12 financing, between 8.5 and 10% of overall K-12 financing in a given year. And so these reforms, both from a spending perspective and just good constitutional governance perspective, largely have to happen at the state and local level. But the federal government should provide flexibility with that small slice of funding that it currently does provide through the taxpayer purse, and allow states to put those existing education dollars toward any lawful education purpose under state law. So if a state wanted to take those funds and use it to revamp teacher compensation or advance education choice options for students, or focus on reading achievement, whatever a state might want to do in conjunction with districts, they should be able to do that with those existing funds.
Thank you. Ms. Weingarten, I wonder if you could respond. It seems that, I hear a lot from people in Michigan, concerns by parents who feel like in public schools that their values are being undermined and their voices are not being heard. Are you hearing that message? And if so, what can be done to restore the confidence that parents have in our public education system?
So thank you for that question, Congressman. What I hear a lot is a lot of frustration. Teachers and parents want more of a voice in terms of, what's happening in terms of a day-to-day basis. And frankly, what I'm hearing this year is that a lot of people wanted more of a way for us to meet the needs of kids, meaning instead of, that kids came back with an awful lot of needs. And so we wanted to try to figure out how to meet those needs. So I've heard a lot of, we don't have enough guidance counselors, we don't have enough nurses, we don't have enough of these kind of things. But what we're also seeing, and this is part of the reason why the AFT is pushing our Reading Opens the World program, is that we really need to get back to the basics of focusing on reading, focusing on the kind of community school work that Chair Delora has really championed, and focused on how we create the pathways to jobs into colleges.
Thank you. And Madam Chair, I see I've extended my stay here, so I yield back.
That's okay. The discussions are good. And with that, Ms. Bustos.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Quickly, before I get to my questions, I do want to briefly echo the sentiments that many of my colleagues have shared about the horrible shooting at the school in Texas. And, obviously all of our hearts are broken. Those of us, who are moms or grandmas or dads and grandpas, there's really nothing worse than learning about these terrible incidents that we've got to do something about. That is my call to action to everybody. We've got to do something legislatively and play our role in helping to get our nation in a better place. Lots of ideas out there, but we need to take that up as well. Thank you, Chair DeLauro. Thank you to our ranking member Cole as well for holding this hearing. I know on a very personal level how important the topic of teacher shortage is. We've done a series of these rural economic roundtables across the 14 counties that I serve in this congressional district in Northwestern Illinois. And at a recent one, at every single one of them, I kid you not, on every single one of them, we heard about teacher shortages. And, obviously, when we've got something that is so important, this foundational profession of teaching, and that we're having trouble attracting and keeping educators across the country. That's why this hearing is so important. In the state of Illinois, we have about 4,100 unfilled teaching positions, paraprofessionals, other staff. So 4,100. And, so obviously we've got, there are a lot of factors that lead into that, but when you get down to it, and Randy Whitegarden, I know you know this probably as well as anybody, if not better than anybody on this Zoom. You know that we're asking a heck of a lot of our teachers and our staff while paying them too little. So we've got a bill that creates incentives for teachers to stay in the profession. One of them that I'm part of is called the Retaining Educators Takes Added Investment Now Act. We call it the Retain Act. That would give fully refundable tax credits for teachers in Title I schools. So the credits would start at $5,800 and ramp up to $11,600 to help retain staff. So Ms. Weingarten, can you talk a little bit about why incentives like those under the Retain Act are really important and maybe even essential if we're going to bring teachers into the workforce and really incentivize them to stay in the workforce?
So thank you, Congresswoman. Look, any of the kind of incentives. So let me just say, we are working on, we have a shortage task force that will present its findings, and we'll do a big focus on this as part of our convention in July. Some of what I talked about today is some of what we're bringing forward. But what you just focused on is so important, because what happens is if you have teachers are better their third year than they are their first year. Dr. Burke, I started as a lawyer before I was a teacher. I was one of those alternatively credentialed teachers. I wish I had a residency program. I was not a good teacher in my judgment my first year. I needed the support that I got from other people. And so by my third year, my fourth year, I was a much better teacher. Those retention bonuses, when people are deciding, are they going to stay in teaching or not? Teaching is a high attrition field. That kind of retention bonus is really important. That kind of retention bump is really important, because then we can keep people in the profession and they can raise a family and live in communities and teach. So that kind of work that you're doing, Congresswoman, is really important in terms of giving us the funding to be able to retain people in their third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, eighth, ninth, 10th year.
So if we can kind of keep along these lines in my questioning, of the 14 counties that I mentioned, 11 of the 14 are very, very rural. In fact, 85% of the towns in the congressional district that I represent have 5,000 residents or fewer in the towns, and 60% or 1,000 people or fewer. And so we're seeing these shortages in rural areas in a really big way. Wondering if you have any thoughts about, are there different ways that we should tackle this problem in rural areas versus more urban settings?
Yes, there are, and we're starting to think about that. Look, you and I've had the conversation around what we did in Peoria and having that kind of housing a career tech ed facility that ended up being used for several rural counties and rural areas. You have to deal with the transportation issues and things like that, but you can then figure out how to cluster magnets together so that we have the expertise of a physics teacher or of a teacher of calculus. We've been doing that, frankly, in McDowell County, West Virginia, where we, with Gail Manchin, have been running a private-public partnership adjacent to the school district about how we make sure that we have expertise so that rural areas do not have this kind of deficit. We need to get great teachers who are deeply knowledgeable about these things.
Thank you, Ms. Weingarten. My time has expired. With that, Chairwoman DeLauro, I yield back. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks very, very much. And Congressman Klein.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I want to thank the witnesses for being here today or on this hearing. According to Virginia Department of Education's annual report on critical shortage areas, the top 10 shortage areas this year are special ed, elementary, pre-K through 6, then middle, grade 6 through 8, then career and technical education, then math, grades 6 through 12. It's our priority to ensure that students get a good education, and that stems from good teachers. We need to address the issue head on and find a way to help our states to get students back on track after the closure of schools for almost 2 years. Virginia had an especially aggressive shutdown under our Democrat-led governor and General Assembly. And Virginia schools are struggling as a result, according to a new report presented to our current governor. The data demonstrates lower student achievement in reading and math, wider achievement gaps, reduced transparency, and eroding parent confidence in the Commonwealth's public schools. Our governor mentioned that the significant lowering of expectations, the lack of transparency with data, the weak accountability for these results, that ends today. So I'm hopeful that our new governor will help us get in the right direction. Let me ask Dr. Burke, how would you define a teacher shortage? Is there a national definition, or is this more of a state and local nuanced issue?
Thank you, Representative Klein. I think it's just that, a local nuanced issue, as you put it. We see there, differences across the country, state to state. It's certainly not a national problem that needs to be addressed by Congress. And again, I would point to decisions being made by local public school districts and states across the country. If we look just from 1992 to 2014, we saw per pupil spending increase 27%, inflation adjusted, while teacher salaries actually fell 2% over that same time period. So public schools have really chosen to fund a non-teaching staffing surge rather than direct these ever increasing taxpayer funded dollars to higher teacher salaries.
Absolutely. I saw in your testimony those statistics. Inflation adjusted per pupil spending from 1992 to 2014 increased by 27%, but teacher salaries fell by 2% because public schools chose to fund a non-teaching staffing surge rather than direct ever increasing taxpayer funded spending to higher teacher salaries. And that's just and I'm sure that problem is worse in some states as opposed to others. Some states are probably doing better. It just goes to show why we should encourage states to address the problem as needed, as opposed to impose a one-size-fits-all requirement. Can you talk about how the COVID-19 mandates contributed to the loss of teachers?
Sure. And Representative Klein, you
protect them and encourage them. So I think unions are vitally important to the education of our children. And I'm glad that the NEA and the AFT and every other union is standing up for them. Thank you, Madam Chair. I yield back.
Thank you. Congresswoman Lee. Okay. Oh, wait a minute. Hang on a second. I'm being told here. Excuse me, technological difficulties appear to have arisen. We can't proceed with a fully virtual hearing until the live stream is working. Unlike a situation where one or a couple of remote members are unfortunately left out of participating in a hybrid hearing because the equipment in the hearing room breaks or their equipment at remote location breaks, having a virtual hearing with no live stream breaks House and committee rules that have no flexibility, apparently. It's about, it's working. Is it working now? Give me a break here. Come on, guys, with this technology. All right. We're done, guys. We can move on. Congresswoman Lee, go.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Jeez.
And thank you, Laura, and our ranking member for this hearing. Boy, what a day. Let me also thank all of our panelists for being here today, especially, and for your tremendous work and leadership in securing the future. And that's what you're doing. And let me associate myself with all the remarks about the tragic, horrific massacre yesterday. Gun violence is continuing to kill students, teachers, and staffs. It's an epidemic. It's a public health epidemic, and it's got to stop. And I'm getting so worried that this trauma is settling in and people are becoming numb to this. And I'm wondering now, just in terms of a barrier to the teaching profession, how are teachers now viewing the epidemic of gun violence in terms of wanting to go into the profession? I mean, this is heartbreaking. And so we've got to move quickly on legislative solutions, which my colleagues have cited. So let me just ask Dr. Carver-Thomas a question following up with Congresswoman Bonnie Watson-Coleman. And good to see you, my sister, from Oakland, California, my constituent who's doing a phenomenal job with regard to students of color and teachers of color, and being able to not only relate to these students, but also to teach a curriculum that empowers students to learn and makes it more interesting in terms of reading. I did not have one Black teacher until I got into college. And it was awful because there was no connection to, for example, Black history in the curriculum or African history, no connection to who I was as a human being, which really created a lot of trauma for not only myself, but most Black people who are my age. And so can you talk about just the relationship between teaching one's history also in the context of having teachers of color being able to teach one's history within the context of teaching everyone? And then secondly, with regard to the Augustus Hawkins Center of Excellence, I had the privilege to work for Congressman Ron Dellums and knew Gus Hawkins very well. I spoke at his memorial. I cannot believe that this is just the first time we put $1 million per grantee into the program. This committee did. So can you just tell us what we need to do given the importance of HBCUs as it relates to teacher education and our young people? Because HBCUs really train, 50% of the nation's Black teachers.
Thank you, Representative Lee. I want to reiterate the importance of teachers of color as cultural translators, that teachers of color are able to connect what their students are experiencing to what they're learning in the classroom. And that's important. We see from other research the importance of culturally responsive pedagogy, or essentially just connecting students' experience to new information that they might learn that has an impact on students' ability to achieve. And we see that borne out in the research that those practices lead to better academic outcomes for students, which can go a long way toward addressing some of the longstanding disparities in student opportunities and outcomes that we've seen for decades. And HBCUs and also tribal colleges and universities and other minority serving institutions play an important role in developing teachers who will go into classrooms and serve that important role. And as you mentioned, HBCUs disproportionately prepare teachers of color. They're preparing more teachers of color than, by proportion than other kinds of institutions. And so it's incredibly important that they have the resources they need to be able to create high quality programs like residencies and other kinds of high quality teacher preparation programs that offer the kind of rigorous coursework, closely aligned clinical practice in schools, mentoring from expert mentor teachers, and that experience in the kinds of schools where teachers will ultimately teach. Teachers of color are more likely to teach in schools serving mostly students of color. And it's important that they're able to have the experience teaching in those settings so that they feel confident and well prepared when they enter the classroom and more likely to stay for the long haul.
Can I ask Brandy real quickly before my time is up to comment on the gun violence and how that's affecting teachers, young people entering into the teaching profession?
So thank you, Congresswoman. Look, all morning long, as you can imagine, my phone has been ringing off the hook. What can we do? How do we move through this? So teachers across the country are thinking about two things at the same time. Number one, they're thinking about grandmothers in Buffalo and kids in Texas. Number two, they're thinking about grandmothers in Buffalo and kids in Texas. And then number three, they're thinking about how do we create a safe, welcoming environment for all of us. That's why I lean into in this hearing the whole issue about community schools and wrapping around services. Schools are relational. If we create the trust and reconnect in terms of relationships, particularly in a post-COVID era, that's going to be really, really helpful. And that's what teachers are thinking about, not hardening schools, not arming themselves, but how we can create a safe, welcoming environment.
Thank you. And thank you, Dr. Carver-Thomas, very much, both of you, for your response.
Ms. Frankel.
Hello, Madam Chair. Thank you for this hearing. Thank you to all the panelists today. And I'm going to follow up with something Ms. Weingarten just said. Look, I'm going to express, of course, my just heartbreak for the brutal murders we saw yesterday in Texas and also across this country just in the last several weeks. Because what we're seeing is not just a proliferation of guns, we're seeing a proliferation of hate. I come from Florida. We have a big teacher shortage. It's predicted to be about 9,000 teachers next year. We call ourselves a sunshine state. It's the sunshine state except in the classroom. We've had two policies that the governor and the legislature have just enacted, Ms. Weingarten. I'd like to get your opinion on them. There's a bill that bans any classroom discussion on gender identity, sexual orientation in grades K through 3, and bans discussion that any parent might find inappropriate in grades K through 12. It's been called the Don't Say Gay bill, but obviously it's much more than that. And then there's the Stop Woke Act, which limits workplace and classroom discussions on race, gender, and oppression, stifling education and a dialogue about race, diversity, inclusion, and truths in Americans' founding. In other words, I mean, they banned something like 40 math books because they actually asked the question, one of them, how do you feel about math? So you're not allowed to understand what children are feeling, respecting their family life. And I'm just wondering how, if you've thought about how these restrictions can contribute to recruitment challenges and driving teachers out of the workforce.
So, Congresswoman, as you can imagine, of course I have, but part of what's happened over the course of generations is that when there is uncertainty in communities, there is fertility for a culture war in schools. You saw that back in the Scopes trial, years and years ago on the issue of evolution versus Bible studies. And I say this as someone who is married to a rabbi and very religious. You see this now in terms of the anxiety that parents have, and it's fertile ground because of we have to make sure that we help kids recover and thrive in the aftermath of COVID. It's the aftermath of COVID, as opposed to all the other things. We all tried to do the best we could. In fact, parents get this. The last NPR poll showed that 88% of parents thought that teachers did the best they could. So what we need to do is create an environment in schools where kids are free to dream and free to think and free to be themselves. And that's why the Don't Say Gay law is so negative, because how does a teacher, if a child says something in a class that's under, grade 3, what is a teacher supposed to do? And it hamstrings the relationships between teachers and kids. And in terms of history, I'm a history teacher. We have to teach honest history. There are people right now who can't figure out how to teach about what happened in Buffalo because there are things they can and can't say. We have to trust our kids and make sure parents know what we're doing to actually make sure that kids feel the relationships, the agency, the empathy, so that we can be a more perfect union. We got to trust people to be able to do this.
Yeah, I thank you. And, you know, we don't know yet what the motive was for yesterday's shooting. We do know that some of these other shootings these past several weeks were definitely racist in nature. And we've seen that, you know, for the past several years. I mean, certainly mental health issues. But just getting back to this Florida law is, you know, if it seems to me if teachers have to be on pins and needles, that they can't say anything that would make somebody uncomfortable because they talk about racism, is just an idiotic law and really is going to cause more racism, more hatred, more violence in this country. And with that, thank you all again for being here today. I yield back.
Thank you. We are going to be able to have a second round, and well, determination. I know that Congresswoman Lee is there. Congressman Cole, I believe, is still on. So if there's others, just please let us know. But with that, let me ask, and this is a question to Ms. Weingarten. I'm concerned, and I know you are, and there was a question about parents and teachers and working together earlier. I'm frankly concerned by a lot of the false narratives that are out there by opponents, quite frankly, of public education. Pit educator and parents against each other, make the conditions much more difficult. Now, and you know, there are efforts to scapegoat, target teachers, I think are counterproductive. They don't reflect, in my view, but I want to test this, how parents actually feel about their children's teachers in schools. There was recent data from Hart Research that finds that 72% of parents say the school provides excellent or good quality education. 78% endorse the quality and performance of their teacher. And Ms. Weingarten, you represent many members of the communities that are the first responders to the societal issues like poverty, grief, children's mental health challenges. How have you seen parents and teachers working together to support student learning and to support their success?
So when you look, parents had, and I don't disagree. I actually agree that hybrid learning was one of the worst things that happened. And many of us, and I think my record, I can only speak for myself, is pretty clear about from April 2020, wanting to see how we could get schools reopened. I served on the Cuomo task force to get schools reopened in New York. I wrote endless numbers of op-eds about it. And safety was one of the ways that we did it in a very, very uncertain time. So the question really becomes, how can we create the parent-teacher partnership that is absolutely essential for kids to thrive? And we do it in lots of different ways in lots of different places. But schooling is one of the only places that government gives to parents to actually help their families. And so we have to, on a local level, this is part of the reason why, Chair DeLauro, your bill for, you know, full service community schools is so important, because if we can get the Title I coordinators the money to wrap services around, to have 25,000 of these community schools, and Jeff Canada has taught about this too in terms of the charter sector. If we can actually do this, we have an infrastructure by which parents can always feel comfortable in a school, always get answers in a school, have the kind of childcare that Representative Clark was talking about. Those are the kinds of things we need to do. We need to make sure that the parent-teacher relationship is one that is open and one that is really respected. And what we see is that schools that work have that. And that's what we're trying to do all across the country.
I'm excited to hear you talk about the community schools, because as you know, we put in $75 million for community schools for 2022, which is about a $45 million increase. And it is my intention anyway to increase of that effort. I volunteered again when I was unemployed in the community school. I watched the school open at 6 a.m., close at 9 or 10 p.m. I watched parents, grandparents, kids interacting with each other, all through the day. And it was an environment in which parents were deeply involved with the with their youngsters and what was happening. So I think we're on a track to move back on that. But the other piece of that as well, if you might just talk about, isn't it true? I mean, elected school boards in this country, aren't parents represented in elected school boards so that they have a role in what is happening in the classroom with their kids, and they're on the board, but their kids are in the same school?
Look, I'm a big believer in local governance of schools. And, I've worked in many systems. I worked with Mayor Bloomberg, who had mayoral control in New York City. And yes, the two of us actually raised salaries. He's very proud of this, 43% for school teachers. And it did actually hugely reduce the number of uncertified teachers in New York City. And Dr. Burke, it actually did hugely raise scores the next year after we did some of that work. So but what happens is that when you have local boards and you create trust, it doesn't, every parent has issues that they're struggling with. Every teacher has issues. That it is a tough time in America right now, but it creates trust to have local boards elected by people in the community, and trust is what we're going for. The more, and we see that opponents sometimes say, like Christopher Rufo and others, that they're trying to create distrust to actually, disconnect people from public schooling. But public schooling is something that Republicans and Democrats and independents really think is important in communities, and the boards and locally elected boards help create that trust.
Thank you. Congressman Cole.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. And again, thank all of our witnesses. This is a really good discussion. Let me go to COVID first, and I want to do this without pointing fingers at anybody, because I think we were dealing with an unprecedented situation, and people basically did the best they could wherever they were at. And we've learned some things. My personal view, shutting down schools was probably a big mistake. And we have, in my state, two different examples, because the two largest school systems in Tulsa and Oklahoma City did shut down, but most of the rest did not. They shut down early in right at the end of the school year in 2020, but most of them reopened in the fall of 2020 and remained open under difficult circumstances. And they seem to have better results, honestly, in terms of their kids and all the social problems that we've explored at length in this community. So I'm just going to ask each of you, if you had one or two lessons learned out of COVID, I'd be very interested in what we should think about going forward, should we ever confront something like this again. And hopefully we don't. This was a once in a century event. So we may even in some ways be overthinking it right now. But we know we're going to be dealing with it on this committee for a long time. And we know in your school systems, you're going to be dealing with it, because the after effects, this thing has a very long tail to it. So let me start, Ms. Weingartner, with you, and then anybody else on the panel. You got a couple of suggestions of things we ought to think about, lessons learned from COVID. I'd love to hear them.
So number one, and thank you for the question, Congressman Cole. Number one, we need real consistency to the extent possible in what the public health positioning is. People were very confused, particularly at, yes, COVID changed and the rules changed, but to the extent that we could have real consistency coming from all quarters, that would have helped create trust would have been very, very helpful, because because we believe that safety and resources were the way to reopen schools. And there were many of the people on this committee that I had many conversations with about how we create both safety and in-person learning. That's number one. Number two, we learned how to trust teachers a lot at the beginning of this pandemic. There was no real platforms in lots of different places. There had been lots of virtual learning beforehand. The former Secretary of Education pushed it really hard, but we learned how to trust teachers a lot. Let's not stop trusting teachers now that we're back in person. They were ingenious, they were creative, so were bus drivers, so were food service workers. Let's actually trust them the same way we did when we were in an unprecedented pandemic.
Thank you, Ms. Carver. Thomas?
Thank you.
Doctor, I should say, I'm sorry.
It is Miss, thank you. So I think something that we learned from the pandemic was that there's a sort of a distinction between short-term and long-term solutions to shortages and all of the staffing issues that we've been dealing with during the pandemic. And, you know, the teacher shortage far predates the pandemic and was really exacerbated by the pandemic. And so I think it's important moving forward to think about what are those long-term solutions that can be enacted now so that we're not looking for short-term solutions when we're in crisis mode that really undercut the ultimate outcomes that we want to see for our students.
Thank you very much. Dr. Burke?
Thank you, Representative Cole. The number one lesson that we should take away from COVID is that we should fund students and not systems. That was a big part of the reason parents did not have educational continuity for their children, is that dollars go to school districts and not students themselves. And so when schools shut down, they had very few, if any, choices to make sure their children did have access to in-person instruction. And so that's a really important lesson moving forward, is that every single dollar that we spend should go directly to families to allow them to select into learning environments that work for them, reflect their values, and are open for instruction and safe and effective long-term.
I'm out of time, but Dr. West, if you could quickly respond. I think the chair is always generous with a gavel.
Time, Mr. Cole.
Thank you, Mr. Cole. I appreciate that question. I think just to echo what Desiree said, our shortage in special education has been with us for, as long as I've been doing this work, at least 40 years. And like with many situations, COVID exacerbated what was already there. So we were able to really see this, and these long-term solutions are really important. I'd also point out that there are many students with disabilities with significant health conditions for whom a return to school posed a accelerated threat. So I think that's important to think about when we think about these public health kinds of situations. Clearly, it's preferable to be at school in person. Delivering something like speech therapy online, or if you need a one-to-one assistant, very challenging to do virtually. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Madam Chair, for your indulgence on the time. Yield back.
Absolutely. Thank you. And Congresswoman Lee.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Let me just say, I helped found a community school and worked in a community school. It was the Black Panther Party Community School. And these young people, and Ms. Carver Thomas, the history in Oakland, but the kids who went to this community school soared. And for all the reasons we know. They had teachers who cared about them, teachers who looked like them. There was a curriculum that they could relate to. They excelled in math and science and music, and it was unbelievable. And so I think community schools are really, as long as they're public and, I don't support vouchers or any of the privatizing of public schools, but I think community schools really are a very interesting and excellent structure for low-income kids and especially kids of color. And having said that, I actually worked, when I was in the California legislature, I worked a lot, and now in Congress, on suspension and expulsion of Black boys. A couple of years ago, there was a study that was done that like 40% of African-American babies were expelled and suspended from preschool. And then so I wanted to, and we've asked the Department of Education to get a handle around this. And also in California, in the day, kids were kicked out or expelled from public schools because the code was so vague that there were no real guidelines on what to do if there were issues with children. And of course, there were no resources for alternatives in terms of truancy and making sure teachers had a path to, some support system for children that for whatever reason they thought, needed to be expelled. So I'm wondering now, Ms. Carver-Thomas, if in California that have we helped tighten that up so kids have and teachers have alternatives so they can teach, and so they don't have to be mental health counselors, so they don't have to be public safety officers. And then secondly, if anyone knows what's happening with these young Black boys in preschool, and are they still being expelled like they were a few years ago?
Yes, thank you, Representative Lee, for the question. And there's quite a few different pieces. And the first I'll say is that one of the studies that I mentioned, an LPI study on positive outliers, looked at student outcomes that included things like suspensions and expulsions, disciplinary rates, and showed that teacher certification matters for that. And there's other research showing that when students have more new teachers, novice teachers, they're also more likely to be suspended or expelled or experience these exclusionary disciplinary practices. And so both of those sort of ideas suggest that comprehensive preparation really matters for making sure that teachers are prepared with the instructional strategies that they need to be able to teach without suspending students. We also see that the research shows that when students of color have more teachers of color, they also have fewer rates of suspensions and expulsions and chronic absenteeism. And so it's clear that there are instructional practices that make a difference. And having that access to comprehensive preparation really matters for students' experiences in the classroom. I couldn't speak to the preschool rates of suspensions. It's troubling, but I will say that preparation can make a difference as far as we know.
Randy, can you or Jane or anybody can respond to that issue with regard to little black boys, Black babies?
Just a quick point on that. We do know that students with disabilities and students of color are disproportionately suspended from school and have disproportionately experienced this rejection from school that does not help them advance. We also know that students of color are disproportionately included in special education, particularly Black boys. And it goes back to the skill and expertise of the educators being able to work with them in a research-based way and their knowledge.
Ms. Weingarten?
It's a problem, Congresswoman Lee, and it's part of why data is collected to make sure that that we change this. And one of the ways of doing that is all the restorative justice programs, plus the plus ensuring, as Dr. West just said, that people actually are trained to meet the needs in a culturally competent way of all kids. And it's kind of why we're, getting at it in a lot of different ways. How do you have more diverse teaching staff? How do you actually deal with all issues? How do you create more playtime in schools? How do you make sure that teachers are prepared?
Thank you, Ms. Burke. Would you like to respond?
I don't have any hard data to respond to you, Representative Lee, but we do know that when you control for behavior, that some of those differences do shrink, but I don't have hard numbers that are current.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair. Very important hearing. Again, the day after such a tragedy, it's kind of overwhelming to be here with all of you. And you've lifted our spirits and know that remind us how much work we have to do, but we've got to stop the violence, the gun violence on campuses.
I would just say, Congresswoman Lee, I think Yale Child Study Center has done a lot of work in this area. Dr. Gilliam has worked on this, or to put you in touch with them about what they have found in terms of research and data of what is happening to preschool youngsters, et cetera, and expulsions. We at one point did a briefing on that issue, and it may be that we can work on something like that again. So and have.
I'd like to do that. We've got to get this under control because we've written a lot into our appropriations bills, direction, appropriations, language to address this report. Haven't gotten many reports back from the Department of Education. I mean, this goes back 10 years, and I've been working on this here. So that would be very helpful. And maybe from this point on, we can get a good grasp on what we need to do. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Let me ask Congressman Cole, Tom, if you want to make any closing remarks, and then I will wrap up.
I will quickly, Madam Chair. First of all, thank you again for the hearing. And I marvel at my colleague, Ms. Lee from California, because it's 4 hours earlier out there. And so when you get up that early to participate, just
I'm here, Mr. Cole.
Well, okay. I still marvel at your stamina anyway, but kudos for anybody that's out west that managed to tune into our hearing for any length of time. But it's a very important hearing, and I want to thank each of you, our witnesses, for taking the time. It has been a difficult day, and we've all acknowledged that. But like my friend from California, I appreciate the fact that you do give us some optimism about where we're headed and what our potential is, and without shortchanging any of the problems that we do have. I sometimes think, we tried to do too much at the federal level. And I'm not talking in terms of money. I've often thought we just have too many programs and not enough money. We'd be better off to narrow down on a number of programs and spend the same dollars that we do today, rather than spread ourselves quite as thin as we do. But that's probably the subject of another hearing. And I also do think that we have a larger cultural problem right now that I mentioned in my opening remarks, and I probably should have pursued some of that in questioning, but it's rather amorphous. But I do think the profession has lost a lot of respect, and I regret that. As I said, my son's a public school teacher. When I began my career, it was to be an educator, certainly not to be a politician. I think it's one of the most noble professions that there is. And the fact that we have people literally leaving out of discouragement. I mean, part of that is there's greener pastures and other opportunities, but I think part of it is just exhaustion. And we need to rethink, some of the burdens we put on teachers, and some of the, as Weingart talked about, just the sheer paperwork which we excel at the federal level. We never give you money for free. We always send a list of requirements and reports and what have you. And that's something we ought to think about ourselves. There is a certain level of trust. You either trust people at the local level to make good decisions, or you don't. And I'm not talking here about normal safeguards in terms of making sure money is not misappropriated. But at the end of the day, I like Ms. Burke's idea of money following students and empowering students and their families to make choices. There's a lot of merit in that, I think, and it puts the decision-making and the dollars closer together, and that usually works out better, I think, in the long run. But regardless of that, I appreciate everybody's participation. It was a lively discussion. I thank Mr. Pocan, Madam Chair, for suggesting it to you, and I thank you for following up so quickly and giving us this opportunity today. With that, again, I look forward to continuing to work with my friend, the chair, on these issues, and I yield back.
Thank you very, very much. I too want to say a thank you to Mr. Pocan. I know he isn't on, but in the course of our last hearing, he suggested this, and And quite honestly, as I said earlier, this is the first hearing that we've had on the shortage of teachers since the pandemic. But two things let me just say. I mean, this has been such a really elevated conversation, and I really appreciate the richness of it and the discussion. Something that the ranking member said is that, you know, always revered in our society were teachers. You know, for most families in a, you know, other generation was, you know, wanted you to, you know, pursue teaching. That was the thing to do. And especially for women, that was very, very true. And I think that Ms. Weingarten's, you know, comment about how would you advise your child or your grandchild to go into the teaching profession? How would you want to give them that sense of the nobility of the profession? And we have lost.
Yeah, Chris,
we've lost a lot of that in recently. And what I think is that what we focused here on today is that, you know, a teacher shortage is a national crisis. It existed before the pandemic, and it was exacerbated by the pandemic. Retaining teachers is a crisis, and what we need to try to do that. And so how do we address that? And I mean, I think that, again, with the richness of this conversation has been the suggestions that we've had from witnesses: comprehensive preparation, service scholarships, teacher residencies, mentorships, induction support, improved teaching conditions, grow your own programs, dual certifications, more planning time, reduce class size, improve teacher pay, special education. How do we train more people to be special ed teachers? Teachers of color, how do we, that's a big issue today. Expand access to collective bargaining, expand community schools. I'm so proud that we are having a resurgence of the importance of community schools. We did that a number of years ago, and then they just shut down. And they were vital and dynamic, and then creating that atmosphere for students, children, families, academics, you know, teachers coming together in a place. Mental health support, investing in critical preparation programs. I mention all those because I want to say, and this is encouraging, that we are looking at the federal level recently, and this committee has really made some investments, and that is in teacher quality partnerships, which we increased about $16 million. The Hawkins program, my colleague Congressman Lee, it's $8 million. But it's the first time we've moved in this direction with the Hawkins Centers of Excellence. IDEA, personal preparation. I mentioned community schools, the $75 million. School-based mental health, you know, which we are investing in. And a number of these suggestions that you have made come under these, you know, these categories, and so that we have an opportunity to make the investments at this time in areas that have really been either flat funded or underfunded for years, understanding the breadth of the problems that we face today. And the fact is, we need to prioritize these investments and understand their value in terms of the system that educates our young people, provides them with the opportunities for their future, gives them the path to success. And there is no more noble calling, there's no more greater achievement. Everyone here, parents told them to get an education, You get an education, you can succeed. And that's what you're all in the business to do. And we have done money with one of the biggest increases had been for HBCUs and MSIs. I only say that because I feel good about that we are on track. I want us to be able to, to do more. And when I think about what happened yesterday and how we go forward, because we have to go to go forward, that we have to reassure. I mean, we're not talking here today about gun violence, but we need to address that, and the Congress needs to address that in a very serious way. But we need to assure teachers that they are safe and their families know that they are safe. In the Sandy Hook tragedy, a young woman named Victoria Soto, she, protecting her students, was shot and killed. It may be the same circumstances for the young woman yesterday who had 15, 17 years of teaching. Talk about an experienced teacher. So we have to assure teachers and their families that yes, they are safe, and we respect them and we respect what they do, and put aside those who want to just foment dissension amongst our teachers and our parents. For our students, what can we all say? So I never went to school. I went every day. We all did. Never for a moment did either my parents or I felt I wasn't going to return home that day. And today, it lives with each one of our kids, and it lives with their parents. This is a moral responsibility that we have to address this issue. And to the extent that we can provide at the moment, not only the solace, not only the thoughts, not only the prayers, but addressing this situation. And I'll speak for myself, and I don't know where everybody else is, that we cannot ban assault weapons in this country is pretty much something that I cannot abide. But we need to provide also the kinds of mental health, kinds of efforts that can reassure people, and the kinds of things that reassure people that our schools are a safe environment for their youngster and for the people who teach our youngster, because after parents, teachers have the most time with our children, spend the most time with our children. And we cannot ever forget that, and we cannot ever understand the commitment that they make. We want to work with you. We're willing to address these issues in terms of the various shortages and gaps in the current system that we have. We're trying, but we can try harder, and with all help, we can succeed. So thank you so much for giving your lives to this profession and making sure that our kids are well educated and can realize their dreams and their aspirations. Thank you so much for today.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Ranking Member Cole.
Thank you very much.
Bring it to a close. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you.